Braemar Manor stood silent under a bruised evening sky, though silence would not last the hour. Eowyn Ashcombe balanced a wicker basket of dried valerian and crushed chamomile against her hip as she crossed the servants' yard, her woolen cloak snagging on the gatepost. She had walked the 2 miles from Oakhaven 3 times a week for the better part of a year, delivering remedies to the estate's cook for the kitchen staff's aches and coughs, and never once had she been asked to step past the scullery door. Tonight was different. Tonight the manor was screaming. She heard it before she saw it. A splintering crash somewhere above the east wing, followed by the frantic shouting of men who did not sound frightened of thieves or fire, but of something they could not name. A footman burst from the side entrance so fast he nearly knocked the basket from her arms, his face the color of old candle wax. "Get back to the village, girl," he gasped. "This is no place for—" "What's happened?" Eowyn caught his sleeve before he could bolt further. "Is someone hurt? It's his grace." The footman's voice dropped, as though the walls themselves might report him. "He's been taken by some fit. Weeks now he's not slept. Tonight, he's tearing the north study apart with his bare hands. 3 guards inside, and none of them can hold him." Eowyn had heard whispers of the Duke's condition in the market square. A nobleman gone strange in the head, servants dismissed for gossiping about it, physicians summoned from London who left again within a fortnight, their carriages rattling away at dawn as though fleeing something. She had assumed, as most of Oakhaven assumed, that the stories were exaggerated. Noblemen were prone to theatrics when they were bored or drunk. But the sound coming from the manor now was neither theater nor drink. It was raw and desperate, a man's voice cracking under the weight of something enormous. She should have turned back. Every ounce of sense told her to set down the basket, curtsy to no one, and walk the 2 miles home before anyone thought to blame the herbalist girl for whatever chaos was unfolding inside those walls. She had been rejected from the Regional Medical Guild only a fortnight past, dismissed by 3 scholars in powdered wigs who told her, in front of half the town, that a woman with no formal instruction had no business calling herself anything more than a hedge witch with a mortar and pestle. She had no standing here, no right to interfere in the affairs of a duke, and yet her feet carried her toward the door. Inside, the corridor was in disarray, a shattered vase, an overturned side table, a portrait knocked crooked on its hook. The shouting grew louder as she approached the study, and when she pushed the door open, the scene struck her like a blow. Duke Theron Ashworth stood in the wreckage of what had once been an elegant room. 2 heavy oak chairs lay in splinters near the hearth. Books had been swept from their shelves in violent arcs, their spines cracked open on the floor like broken birds. 3 guardsmen stood at a wary distance, hands raised, none of them daring to close the gap between themselves and the man they were meant to protect and restrain in equal measure. The Duke himself was a wreck of a different kind. His cravat hung loose and torn at his throat, his dark hair disheveled as though he had clawed at it himself, and his eyes, pale gray, wide, unblinking, held the glassy, hunted look of a man who had not slept in longer than any human body could reasonably endure. His chest heaved with each breath, his hands trembled violently at his sides, fingers curling and uncurling, as though they belonged to someone else entirely. "Get out," he snarled at the guards, though his voice cracked halfway through the command, betraying exhaustion beneath the fury. "All of you, get out before I—" He did not finish. His body swayed, caught between collapse and another surge of violence, and none of the guards moved to help him, too afraid of what his flailing arms might do. Eowyn set the basket down without thinking and walked forward. "Miss, don't—" One of the guards hissed, but she was already past him, already close enough to smell the sweat and desperation clinging to the Duke's ruined shirt. He turned on her with the wild-eyed suddenness of a cornered animal, and for one breathless moment she thought he might strike her, might not even see her as a person at all, in whatever storm was raging behind his eyes. She reached out and placed her hand firmly on his shoulder. The change was immediate and impossible to mistake. His breath, which had been coming in ragged, tearing gasps, seemed to catch and then slow. The wild tremor in his hands stilled. His shoulders, which had been drawn up around his ears like a man bracing for a blow, dropped by degrees, and his eyes, still fixed on her face, cleared of their frantic glaze, as though a fever had broken all at once. The room fell utterly silent. Even the guards seemed to have stopped breathing. "What?" the Duke said, his voice now low and unsteady in an entirely different way. "Did you just do to me?" Elowen did not remove her hand. She was not entirely certain she could have, even if she'd wished to. Something in his gaze held her fixed, as surely as her touch had held him. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "I only meant to stop you from hurting yourself." Neither of them noticed the guards exchanging bewildered glances behind them, nor the first servants creeping back to the doorway to witness what none of them would ever quite manage to explain to the rest of the household. All Elowen could see was the Duke's face, transformed from wild fury to something raw and searching, as though she had shown him a door out of a room he'd been trapped in for weeks. She had no way of knowing yet that she had just changed the course of both their lives. Dawn crept over Braemar Manor in pale, hesitant streaks, and for the first time in weeks, the household woke to silence instead of shouting. Elowen had not left. She had meant to, twice. Once when the guards finally regained enough composure to offer her a seat by the fire, and once when the housekeeper arrived, wringing her hands and demanding to know what a village girl was doing in the master's private study at such an hour. But each time Elowen made to rise, the Duke's hand had closed gently around her wrist, not gripping, only asking, and she had found she could not bring herself to refuse him. He had slept at last, sitting upright in a salvaged chair, with her hand still resting against his shoulder, for nearly 4 hours. It was the longest unbroken rest he had managed, she would later learn, in over a fortnight. Now, in the gray light of morning, he sat across from her at a small table that had survived the previous night's destruction, dressed in a fresh shirt and coat, his hair combed back into some semblance of order. The wildness had drained from his face, leaving behind a man who looked, Elowen thought, rather younger than she had expected, perhaps not yet 30, and desperately tired, in a way that sleep alone had not yet cured. "You should know," he said carefully, as though testing each word before he let it loose, "that I do not ordinarily behave as you saw me last night." "I gathered as much," Elowen replied. "The whole of Oakhaven has heard rumors, though I confess I thought them exaggerated." A ghost of something like embarrassment crossed his face. "I have not slept, truly slept, in over 2 weeks. The physicians from London called it a nervous affliction of the mind, and left me with tinctures that did nothing but make my hands shake worse. My own guard has taken to sleeping outside my chamber door, not to protect me from thieves, but to keep me from destroying the house around myself." He paused, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, and yet held her fast. "And then you touched my shoulder, and it stopped. All of it, as though someone had simply turned down a lamp that had been burning too high." Elowen folded her hands in her lap, uncertain how to answer something so far beyond her understanding. "I've no explanation for it, Your Grace. I've studied herbs and simples since I was little at my mother's side." Touch was never part of what she taught me, and yet it worked where London's finest physicians failed. He leaned forward slightly. "I want you to remain here, as my physician." The words startled a short, disbelieving laugh out of her before she could stop it. "Your Grace, I am not a physician. I hold no license, no guild standing. The regional guild rejected my application not a fortnight past, told me plainly, in front of half the town, that a woman with no formal instruction had no business treating anyone beyond a scraped knee. Then the guild are fools," he said simply, "and I have had quite enough of fools pretending at expertise they do not possess. I have paid 3 separate physicians a small fortune to prescribe me sleeping draughts and bloodletting, and none of them accomplished in 6 months what you managed in a single touch of your hand." He sat back, and something almost pleading entered his voice, though he tried visibly to mask it beneath the authority of his rank. "I am not a well man, Miss Ashcombe, Elowen Ashcombe. Miss Ashcombe, I do not know what will happen the next time this affliction takes hold of me, nor whether next time the household will be so fortunate as to have you standing nearby. I am asking you, formally, to accept a position as my attending physician. Room, board, and a physician's wage, whatever you judge fair. In exchange, I ask only that you remain close enough to reach me, should I need you." Elowen's mind raced through the implications, even as her heart, unbidden, gave a small and unwelcome flutter at the earnestness in his request. A position such as this would mean leaving Oakhaven, leaving her mother's cottage and the modest apothecary shelf she had spent years building, and it would mean leaving behind the patients who had come to rely on her, the widow Hargrove with her swollen joints. "I cannot abandon my patients in the village," she said finally. "There is no other healer within 6 miles who will treat the poor without demanding coin they don't have. If I am to accept this position, I must be permitted to continue my work in Oakhaven, to visit my patients, to keep my apothecary stocked and my door open to anyone who needs it." She expected him to argue, to insist that a duke's private physician had no business tending to farmers and laundresses. Instead, something in his expression eased, as though her condition had confirmed, rather than complicated, his judgment of her character. "Then it is agreed," he said. "You shall have use of the estate's carriage whenever you require it for your rounds, and I will see that your mother's cottage wants for nothing in your absence. All I ask is that you remain within reach should the affliction return." He extended his hand across the table, an oddly formal gesture given the intimacy of what had passed between them only hours before. Lowen hesitated only a moment before taking it, and felt, even in that brief and proper handshake, the faint tremor still lingering beneath his composed exterior, a reminder of how fragile his calm truly was, and how entirely he had come to depend, in the span of a single night, on a herbalist the guild had cast aside. Neither of them spoke of what it might mean that his hand did not shake at all while it remained in hers. The carriage set out for Oakhaven 2 days later, laden with empty crates meant to be filled with Elowen's herbal stores and whatever else her modest workshop could offer, toward the Duke's care. Theron had insisted on accompanying her himself over the mild protests of his household, who seemed to feel it improper for a duke to go rattling down country lanes on errands better suited to servants. "I have spent 6 months being managed by servants and physicians alike," he told his steward, with a firmness that left no room for further argument. "I should like, for once, to see to my own recovery." Elowen sat across from him in the carriage, watching the hedgerows and stone walls of the estate give way to open farmland, the late autumn light turning the fields the color of weak tea. She found herself unexpectedly at ease in his company, given the wildness she had witnessed only 2 nights past. In the daylight, dressed in his dark traveling coat, he seemed almost ordinary, a man with tired eyes and a quiet, watchful manner, asking her small questions about the herbs she gathered and how she had come to learn her craft. "My mother," she told him, "was taught by her mother, who learned from a French woman who settled near Oakhaven when I was too small to remember her. It has always been women's knowledge, passed hand to hand. The guild does not think much of knowledge that was never written in a book." "Then the guild's loss is considerable," he said, "for I have never slept so soundly as I did in that chair 2 nights ago." She might have answered him, might have deflected the compliment with some modest remark about coincidence or luck, but the carriage lurched suddenly and came to a halt, throwing her forward against the seat. Through the small window, she could see the driver climbing down, muttering under his breath at whatever obstruction lay ahead. "The road's given way, Your Grace," the driver called back, his voice apologetic. "Mud's taken the wheel near to the axle. We'll need to see about freeing it, or find another route round." Theron said nothing at first, but Elowin noticed the change in him immediately. A stillness that was not calm, but its opposite, a held breath before a storm. His hands, which had rested easily on his knees only a moment before, curled slowly into fists. "Your Grace?" "It is nothing," he said, though his voice had gone tight and strange. "A delay only." But it was not nothing. She watched the tremor begin in his fingers first, a fine shiver that spread quickly up through his wrists, and his breathing, which had been unremarkable a moment before, began to quicken into something shallow and uneven. His eyes, when they met hers, held the first edges of the same wild, hunted look she had seen in the ruined study, not yet the full storm, but its clear and unmistakable beginning. "I do not know why," he said, and there was something almost like shame in his voice. "Delays of this kind, small confinements, small helplessness, they seem to unsettle whatever balance remains in me. The physicians called it a weakness of nerve. I have never been able to explain it better than that." Elowin did not hesitate. She reached across the narrow space between them and took his wrist in her hand, her fingers pressing firm against the racing pulse beneath his skin, much as she had pressed her palm to his shoulder 2 nights before. The effect was immediate, and this time she watched it happen rather than simply feeling its aftermath. His breath caught, held, and then released in a long, shuddering exhale. The tremor in his hand stilled beneath her fingers. His shoulders, which had begun to draw up toward his ears in that same defensive posture she now recognized, eased back down, and the wild edge in his eyes softened into something calmer, though no less intent as it fixed upon her face. "There," she said softly, as much to herself as to him. "You see, it is not weakness of nerve. Whatever ails you responds to more than luck or coincidence." He did not answer at once. He seemed to be studying her hand, where it still circled his wrist, as though trying to understand, through sight alone, what his body already seemed to know through touch. "Twice now," he said finally. "Twice you have done this, and both times without hesitation, as though you expected it to work." "I did not expect anything," Elowin admitted. "I only knew that watching you suffer without trying to help was not something I could bring myself to do." Outside, the driver's shouts and the grunt of effort, as the wheel was finally freed from the mud, filtered faintly into the carriage, but neither of them moved to acknowledge it. Theron's gaze held hers with an intensity that made her acutely conscious of her hand still resting against his skin, of the closeness of the carriage, of how very easy it would be to forget in this small and private moment, that he was a duke and she was an unlicensed herbalist, with no standing beyond what her own 2 hands could prove. "Miss Ashcombe," he said quietly, "I begin to suspect that whatever effect you have upon me is not something either of us fully understands yet." "No," she agreed, drawing her hand back at last as the carriage jolted forward once more, the journey resuming beneath them. "But I intend to find out." Neither of them spoke again until the spires of Oakhaven rose into view, though the silence between them had changed its character entirely. No longer the silence of strangers, but something quieter and far more uncertain, laced with a question neither was yet prepared to ask aloud. The high sanctuary archives occupied a squat stone building at the edge of Oakhaven's Market Square, its shelves crowded with ledgers, medical treatises, and the guild's carefully guarded records of approved remedies. Elowyn had visited only twice before in her life, both times as a hopeful applicant clutching notes on her mother's tinctures, and both times she had left feeling smaller than when she'd entered. She had not expected to return so soon, and certainly not with a duke's carriage waiting outside. "I need to know if anyone has recorded a condition like yours before," she explained to Theron as they climbed the archive's worn stone steps. "Some affliction of the nerves that responds to touch. If it has happened before, there may be some understanding of why, some record that could help me treat you properly, rather than simply reacting each time the fits take hold." The archive's keeper, a stooped elderly man with ink-stained fingers, recognized her at once and led them without comment to the medical section, though his eyes lingered curiously on the fine cut of Theron's coat. Elowyn had barely begun pulling volumes from the shelves, scanning indexes for any mention of nervous afflictions or sympathetic touch, when a voice cut across the quiet reading room like a blade. "Miss Ashcombe, I confess myself surprised to find you darkening these halls again, given how plainly the guild's position was made clear to you." Master Corvus stood in the archive doorway, resplendent in the guild's dark formal robes, his powdered wig slightly askew, as though he had rushed to intercept her the moment word reached him of her presence. He was the same scholar who had led her rejection a fortnight past, the same voice that had called her knowledge unworthy of the guild's name in front of half the town's gathered physicians. "I am not here on guild business, Master Corvus," Elowyn said evenly, though she felt her spine straighten of its own accord. "I am conducting research on behalf of a patient." "A patient?" Corvus's gaze slid past her to Theron, and something in his expression shifted from disdain to calculation with unsettling speed. "Your Grace, I had not realized you required a physician's care." "Had I known, I would have recommended someone with proper credentials rather than a village hedge healer playing at medicine beyond her station. Miss Ashcombe has succeeded where 3 London physicians failed," Theron said, his voice carrying the flat, dangerous calm of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I would think that achievement speaks for itself, credentials or none. With respect, Your Grace, success achieved through luck is not the same as success achieved through knowledge." Corvus stepped further into the room, addressing Theron now with the smooth, practiced tone of a man selling something. "The Guild has trained physicians of considerable skill in matters of nervous affliction. I would be glad to arrange a proper consultation, one grounded in established medical understanding, rather than whatever folk remedy Miss Ashcombe has stumbled upon." Elowyn felt heat rise in her cheeks, less from embarrassment now than from a slow-building anger she had not expected. "I have not stumbled upon anything, Master Corvus. I have observed, 3 times now, a consistent and repeatable effect." "That is precisely the kind of evidence your guild claims to value, is it not?" Or does observation only count when it comes wrapped in a diploma? A flicker of surprise crossed Corvus's face, quickly smoothed over. Bold words for someone the guild found unfit to practice unsupervised. Unfit by your judgment, Elowin shot back. Made by men who spent perhaps 10 minutes examining my knowledge before dismissing it. My mother treated half of Oakhaven for 30 years without a single credential to her name, and not one patient of hers ever complained of the lack. Theron had gone very still throughout this exchange, watching Corvus with an expression Elowin could not quite read, though she noticed the faint tension returning to his shoulders, not the wild, uncontrolled tremor of his affliction, but something colder and more deliberate. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge that made even Corvus take an involuntary step backward. Master Corvus, I believe you mistake the purpose of this visit. Miss Ashcombe is not here seeking your approval, nor mine, for that matter. She is here because I have retained her as my sole attending physician, a position she has earned through demonstrated results rather than examination fees paid to your guild's treasury. Your Grace, surely you cannot mean to formalize such an arrangement. The scandal alone, the scandal, Theron interrupted, would be permitting a woman capable of curing what your London colleagues could not, to continue being dismissed by men, more concerned with protecting their guild's authority than with actual healing. I am withdrawing my family's retainer from the guild, effective today. You may inform the council at your convenience. The silence that followed was absolute. Corvus's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound emerged, his composure cracking at last into something close to panic. Your Grace, the Ashworth family retainer has supported this guild for 3 generations. Surely you would not. I would, and I have. Theron turned back toward the shelves, effectively dismissing the scholar with his posture alone. Good day, Master Corvus. Corvus lingered a moment longer, his eyes finding Elowin's with an expression that had curdled from disdain into something far uglier, the particular resentment of a man who has just watched his authority evaporate in front of a rival he considers beneath him. Then, without another word, he turned and swept from the room, his robes snapping behind him like an angry bird's wings. Elowin let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. You did not need to do that. The retainer was never worth more to me than your good name, Theron said simply, returning his attention to the shelf of volumes before him. Now, you mentioned wanting to find some historical record of my condition. Shall we continue looking, or has Corvus's visit exhausted your patience for archives today? Elowin found herself, despite everything, smiling. I believe I can manage a little longer, Your Grace. Caelan Hall blazed with candlelight for the autumn assembly, its ballroom filled with the county's finest families, dressed in silks and velvets that made Elowin acutely aware of her own plain gray gown, borrowed from the housekeeper's niece for the occasion. She had not wanted to attend at all, but Theron had insisted, quietly explaining that his absence from such gatherings had already fed enough rumor, and that appearing composed among society would do more to settle the guild's whispers than any number of private consultations. You need not dance, he had told her in the carriage. Only stand near enough that I might reach you, should the evening prove difficult. She had not expected the evening to prove difficult quite so quickly. Word of the withdrawn retainer had traveled faster than either of them anticipated, and it seemed half the guests in attendance had heard some version of the story by the time the first course was cleared. Elowin felt the weight of curious glances all evening, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she passed, Fans raised to hide murmured speculation about the Duke's peculiar new physician and what precisely her duties might entail. She bore it as best she could, remaining near the edges of the room, until Master Corvus arrived flanked by two fellow scholars from the guild, their formal robes exchanged for evening dress that did nothing to soften the calculating look in Corvus's eyes as he located her across the crowded floor. "Miss Ashcombe," he approached with the easy confidence of a man who had planned this encounter well in advance. "How fortunate to find you here. My colleagues were most curious to meet the physician who has so thoroughly outperformed London's finest." The two scholars beside him, one thin and sharp-featured, the other older, with heavy jowls, regarded her with barely concealed amusement, the kind reserved for a joke everyone present understood except its subject. "Perhaps," Corvus continued, raising his voice just enough to draw the attention of nearby guests, "you might demonstrate for us the medical principles behind your remarkable cure. I confess considerable curiosity as to which text informs your methods. Galen, perhaps, or some more obscure authority?" Elowen felt the trap closing even as she recognized its shape. A crowd was gathering now, drawn by the scent of spectacle, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that Corvus intended to humiliate her publicly, to force her into either admitting ignorance of formal medicine or inventing some false credential that could later be exposed and used to discredit her entirely. "I have never claimed authority from any text, Master Corvus," she said carefully. "Only from observation and experience." "Ah, but surely, observation alone cannot explain such a dramatic effect. Perhaps you might elaborate on the specific mechanism by which your touch calms His Grace's nervous affliction. The circulatory theory, perhaps? Or do you subscribe to some theory of animal magnetism?" The sharp-featured scholar's lip curled as he spoke the last words, clearly expecting her to flounder. Elowen felt her pulse quicken, the familiar heat of anger rising in her chest, and beside her, she sensed rather than saw the shift in Theron's posture, a stillness settling over him that she now recognized, with some alarm, as the early edge of his own distress. The crowd, the scrutiny, the deliberate public cornering of someone he had chosen to protect. It was exactly the kind of confined, helpless pressure that had triggered his fits before. She glanced sideways and saw the faint tremor beginning in his jaw, the tightness gathering at his temples, his breath growing shallow beneath his composed exterior. No one else in the crowd seemed to notice yet, too fixed on the unfolding confrontation to watch the Duke himself. But Elowen saw it plainly, and understood she had only moments before his affliction announced itself, before the very society he had brought her here to reassure. Without breaking her gaze from Corvus, she reached over and rested her hand lightly against Theron's forearm, her fingers curling gently around the fine wool of his sleeve. The effect was immediate, though this time it played out beneath the surface rather than in dramatic collapse. His breath steadied, the tension in his jaw eased, and the wild edge that had begun creeping into his eyes receded before it could fully surface. To the watching crowd, it looked like nothing more than a physician's physician touching her patron's arm in quiet familiarity. Only Elowen felt the true weight of what had just been prevented. Emboldened by his renewed calm, she turned back to Corvus with a composure she had not felt a moment before. "I do not subscribe to any theory, Master Corvus, because I have not yet had the leisure of formal study to develop one. What I have is results, which is more than I can say for the Guild's approved treatments, none of which managed in 6 months what a single touch accomplished in a single evening. Perhaps, Rather than demanding I explain a mechanism your own scholars have failed to identify in centuries of study, your guild might consider that there remain things in medicine not yet written in your approved texts. A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the nearest guests, and Corvus's face reddened beneath his powdered wig. Beside her, Theron straightened fully, his composure entirely restored, and addressed the gathered crowd with the unmistakable authority of his rank. "I believe Miss Ashcombe has answered quite sufficiently," he said. "Master Corvus, I trust you and your colleagues can find other amusements for the evening. My physician and I have no further interest in providing spectacle for the guild's entertainment." Corvus opened his mouth to protest, seemed to think better of it under the weight of so many watching eyes, and instead offered a stiff bow before retreating with his companions into the crowd, though not before Eowyn caught the venomous glance he threw her way, a look that promised this was far from finished. Word of the fever reached Oakhaven 3 days after the assembly, carried by a breathless farmhand who had ridden from Fenbrook with news that half the hamlet had taken ill within a single night. Eowyn was in her workshop sorting dried elderflower when he arrived at her door, and she abandoned her work at once, already reaching for her satchel of remedies before he had finished explaining. "It's the damp season fever," he told her, wringing his cap between his hands. "Started with the Hobbs and spread through half the cottages by the river. Old Widow Turner says 3 more have taken to their beds since morning, and there's no physician within reach who'll treat folk who can't pay proper coin." "I'll come at once," Eowyn said, already moving toward the shelves where she kept her stores of willow bark and feverfew. "Tell them to keep the sick separated where they can, and boiled water for anyone with a fever above. I'm coming with you." She turned to find Theron in the doorway, having followed her from the manor that morning, on some pretense of accompanying her rounds. He had already shed his fine coat for something plainer, sleeves rolled to the forearm, as though he meant to work rather than merely observe. "Your Grace, this is fever country. Contagious illness, cramped cottages, no place for a duke, you mean?" He said it without heat, only quiet certainty. "I am aware of what I am, Miss Ashcombe, and aware also that Fenbrook has no physician of its own, because the guild has never troubled itself to send one to a hamlet too poor to pay guild fees. I do not intend to stand idle in my study while you work yourself past exhaustion, tending to people my own family has neglected." There was no arguing with him when his voice took that particular tone, and in truth, Eowyn found she did not entirely wish to. She had grown accustomed, over these past weeks, to his presence beside her, not merely as the source of the affliction she treated, but as a steady pair of hands, increasingly willing to be useful. Fenbrook, when they arrived, was worse than the farmhand's account had suggested. The hamlet's dozen cottages huddled along the riverbank, damp and close-built, and nearly every door stood open with the low murmur of fever-sick voices drifting into the gray midday air. Eowyn moved from house to house with practiced efficiency, checking pulses, feeling foreheads, dosing willow bark tea for the fevers, and dark honey mixtures for the coughing that had settled into several small chests. Theron, to her genuine surprise, proved himself far from useless. He carried water where it was needed, and organized the scattered stores of clean linen and firewood with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to managing an estate's household, even one so far removed from his own grand halls. "You've done this before," she observed, watching him settle a fretful toddler against his shoulder, while its mother, too weak to rise, wept quiet thanks from her bed. "Never quite like this," he admitted, "though I spent enough years being dragged through my father's tenant visits as a person to know how a sick room ought to be managed, if not how to heal one." By mid-afternoon, the worst of the immediate crisis had settled into manageable rhythm, and Eowyn allowed herself a brief pause to assess what remained. 3 cottages, yet unvisited, dwindling supplies of willow bark, and a fatigue beginning to pull at her limbs that she did not have the luxury of indulging. She glanced toward Theron, expecting perhaps the first signs of his own strain after hours in close, crowded quarters, exactly of the kind that had triggered his fits before. He looked tired, certainly, his shirt damp with exertion and his dark hair falling loose across his forehead, but the wild edge she had come to watch for was entirely absent. His hands, when she caught sight of them steadying a basin of water for an elderly patient, showed no tremor at all. "You've not needed me today," she said, half to herself, though he heard her plainly enough. "I've needed you every moment," he corrected gently. "Only not in the way you mean. Perhaps it is enough, some days, to know you are within reach, without requiring the reaching itself." The observation settled into her chest with unexpected weight, and she found herself studying him more closely as the afternoon wore on, noting how he stayed always within a few paces of wherever she worked, how his gaze found her across each crowded cottage, as though confirming her presence, before returning to whatever task occupied his hands. It was not dependence exactly, not the desperate, uncontrolled need of that first, terrible night in the ruined study. It was something quieter, and she suspected, considerably more dangerous to the careful distance she had been trying to maintain between physician and patient. By evening, with the worst cases stabilized and the hamlet's own women organized into a rotation of care for the coming days, Eowyn finally allowed herself to sit on the low stone wall outside the Hobbs cottage, her satchel emptied and her hands finally still. Theron settled beside her without invitation, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, watching the last light fade over the river. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For today, Fenbrook has needed help like this for years, and no one has ever troubled themselves to give it." "Then perhaps," he said, "it required someone to show me how badly it was needed, and someone else willing to walk into a fever-ridden hamlet, rather than simply writing about it in reports she never reads." He glanced at her sideways, something warm and unguarded in his expression that she had not seen from him before. "I find I am considerably more capable, Miss Ashcombe, when I have something worth being capable for." They returned to Oakhaven 2 days later, once Fenbrook's fever had broken and the last of the sick people were sitting up and asking for bread rather than broth. Eowyn had sent word ahead to her cottage that she would need to restock her dwindling supplies before continuing her rounds, and Theron had insisted on accompanying her, claiming some vague business in the village that both of them understood to be an excuse for staying close by her side. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of early autumn day that made the walk from the manor gate pleasant, rather than tiresome, and Eowyn found herself in unexpectedly good spirits as they approached her workshop, a modest stone outbuilding behind her mother's cottage, where she dried her herbs, distilled her tinctures, and stored the careful accumulation of a lifetime's knowledge. The good spirits did not survive opening the door. The workshop had been torn apart. Shelves that had held neat rows of dried herbs lay overturned, their contents scattered and trampled across the floor. Years of carefully gathered valerian and feverfew and chamomile ground into the dirt beyond any hope of salvage. Her distillation equipment, glass vessels her mother had passed down, and Eowyn had saved half a year's coin to replace when they cracked, lay shattered in glittering fragments across the workbench. Even her notebooks, pages of careful observation recorded over a decade of practice, had been torn from their bindings and strewn about the room like autumn leaves. Elowen stood frozen in the doorway, unable for a long moment to make sense of the destruction, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes plainly showed her. "No," she whispered, finally moving forward, dropping to her knees amid the ruin to gather what fragments of her notes she could reach, though most were beyond saving, ink smeared and pages torn past any hope of piecing back together. "No, no, this cannot." Behind her, she heard Theron's breathing change, and some distant, professional part of her mind noted the danger even through her own grief. The tightness entering his voice, the stillness that was not calm settling over him as he took in the scene. Who did this? His voice had gone flat and cold in a way she had not heard before, entirely different from the wild, uncontrolled fury of his fits. This was something deliberate, something building with terrible precision. "I don't know," she managed, though even as she said it, a name rose unbidden in her thoughts, the memory of Corvus's venomous glance at the assembly, his promise, unspoken but unmistakable, that their confrontation was far from finished. She turned to find Theron standing rigid amid the wreckage, his hands curled into fists at his sides, his jaw tight, and she recognized with sudden alarm the same building pressure she had witnessed twice before, the storm gathering behind his eyes, threatening to break loose in violence against whatever remained standing in this small, ruined room. "Your Grace, Corvus." He said the name like an accusation already proven. This bears his mark plainly enough. Petty, cowardly, and precisely the sort of retaliation a man too weak to challenge me directly would instead visit upon someone he judges an easier target. We don't know that for certain. I know enough. He took a step further into the workshop, his boot crunching over broken glass, and Elowen saw his hand reach toward an overturned shelf as though he meant to tear it apart entirely, to visit upon the room some equal measure of the destruction already inflicted, his breath coming faster now, his composure fracturing visibly before her eyes. She rose quickly from where she knelt among her ruined notes and crossed to him, taking both of his hands in hers before he could complete whatever violent gesture his rage demanded. His hands were shaking, not with the helpless tremor of his affliction this time, but with barely contained fury, and she held them firm between her own, forcing his attention down to her face rather than the wreckage surrounding them. Theron. It was the first time she had used his given name without title, and she saw it register in his eyes, even through his anger, some small crack in the storm. Breaking what remains will not restore what's lost. I need you steady, not destructive. Please. His breath caught, held, and slowly released, the tension in his hands easing beneath her grip, though it did not vanish entirely. They destroyed years of your work, your mother's equipment, everything you've built for yourself, despite every obstacle that Guild placed before you, and you ask me to simply stand here and accept it? I ask you to help me save what can still be saved, she said, rather than adding to the wreckage. There are herbs here, not entirely ruined, notes I might yet reconstruct from memory. I would rather have your steady hands, sorting through what remains, than watching you tear apart what little is left standing. Something in her steady, practical grief seemed to reach him more effectively than any plea for calm alone could have managed. He exhaled slowly, and though his eyes still carried the banked fire of barely controlled anger, his hands finally stilled entirely beneath hers. I will find whoever did this, he said quietly, and I will see them answer for it. But you are right, that this moment belongs to salvage, not vengeance. He glanced down at their joined hands, something almost rueful, entering his expression, despite the circumstances. "It seems you have found yet another use for your touch, Miss Ashcombe. I begin to wonder if there exists any storm within me it cannot calm." Elowyn released his hands slowly, feeling the loss of that contact more keenly than she cared to examine, and turned back toward the wreckage of her workshop with a steadying breath of her own. Let us hope we never need discover the answer to that question. The journey to Aethelgard took the better part of 2 days. The manor's carriage, rattling southwest, along coastal roads that grew increasingly wild and windswept the further they traveled from Oakhaven's familiar hedgerows. Theron had proposed the trip himself 3 days after the destruction of Elowyn's workshop, explaining that his family held a smaller estate along the cliffs where rare coastal plants grew nowhere else in the county. Plants his grandmother had once used, he recalled vaguely, in treating nervous complaints of her own. "It may be nothing," he admitted, as their carriage rocked over a particularly uneven stretch of road. "My memory of her remedies is past memory, unreliable at best. But if there is any chance of crafting something more lasting than the temporary relief your touch provides, I think it worth the journey." Elowyn had agreed readily enough, partly for the plants themselves, and partly, though she admitted this only to herself, for the chance to put some distance between them and Oakhaven, where Corvus's shadow seemed to fall over every corner of her daily life since the workshop's destruction. The guild had made no formal accusation, offered no confession, but the satisfaction in Corvus's bearing whenever their paths crossed in the village square told her plainly enough that Theron's suspicions had not been misplaced. The coastal road narrowed as they traveled, hedgerows giving way to open moorland, and eventually the first glimpses of gray sea beyond distant cliffs. It was during these long, empty stretches, with nothing to fill the silence but the creak of the carriage and the cry of distant gulls, that Theron began speaking of things he had not mentioned before. "My father held very particular ideas about what a duke ought to be," he said, watching the passing moorland rather than meeting her eyes. "Unshakable, untroubled by weakness of any kind, whether of body or temperament. I was perhaps 12 when I first learned to hide any sign of distress from him, and considerably older before I understood that the hiding itself had become its own kind of illness." Elowyn said nothing, sensing that he needed the silence more than any response she might offer, and after a moment he continued. "The affliction that brought us together did not appear suddenly, whatever the household believed. It built for years. Sleepless nights I told no one of. Tremors I concealed beneath gloves and long sleeves. Small fits of temper I explained away as the ordinary frustrations of managing an estate. By the time it grew beyond my ability to hide, I had spent so many years pretending composure that I no longer knew how to ask for help, even when I most desperately needed it." He glanced at her then, something rawer in his expression than she had yet seen from him. "You are the first person who did not wait for me to ask." "I did not think to ask myself, if I am honest," Elowyn admitted. "I only saw someone in pain and reacted before I had the chance to consider whether it was my place to do so." "And has it always been so? This instinct to help before considering the cost to yourself?" She considered the question longer than she had expected to, watching the gray sea grow steadily closer through the carriage window. "My mother used to say I inherited it from my grandmother, who by all accounts would walk 3 villages over in a snowstorm rather than leave a sick person untended. I used to think it a kind of foolishness, honestly. The guild certainly thought so, when they saw how little coin I demanded from patients who could not pay. But I could never quite bring myself to change it. There is something in me that cannot walk past suffering, I have the means to ease, whatever it costs me to stop and offer it." "It has cost you a great deal," Theron observed quietly. "Your workshop, your standing with the guild, though I suspect that particular loss weighs less heavily than the guild would like to believe. Perhaps in time, your reputation in the wider world as well, should certain quarters of society decide there is scandal to be found in a duke's unusual attachment to his physician." Eowyn felt her cheeks warm at the implication, though she did not look away from him. "I have never been much troubled by what society chooses to whisper about me, Your Grace. I learned that lesson rather thoroughly the day the guild rejected my application in front of half the town." "Theron," he corrected softly. "You used my given name once already, in my workshop's wreckage. I find I would like to hear it again when circumstances are rather less dire." "Theron," she repeated, and found the word sat more comfortably on her tongue than she had expected. "What is it you hope to find in Æthelgard, truly, beyond your grandmother's remedies?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching the first gray walls of the cliffside estate come into view through the window, weathered stone standing stark against sky and sea. "I hope," he said finally, "to find some way of managing this affliction that does not depend entirely upon you remaining forever within arm's reach. Not because I wish for distance between us, but because I think you deserve, eventually, the freedom to build a life of your own, a proper practice, patience of your own choosing, perhaps even the recognition the guild has so far denied you, without being tethered permanently to my particular storm." Eowyn did not answer at once, surprised by the quiet generosity of the wish, and by the unexpected ache it stirred in her chest at the thought of a future in which her presence beside him was no longer necessary. It was, she realized slowly, precisely what she ought to want. Her independence restored, her purpose no longer bound to his affliction. She found she was not entirely certain, watching him in the fading afternoon light, that it was what she wanted at all. Æthelgard's cliffside gardens yielded more than either of them had hoped. By the second afternoon, Eowyn had gathered a modest collection of sea lavender, samphire, and a curious silvery-leafed plant the estate's aging groundskeeper called simply cliff balm, insisting it had been her ladyship's, Theron's grandmother's, particular favorite for settling troubled nerves. "She used to walk these cliffs every evening," the old man told them, his weathered face creasing with memory. "Said the sea air did more for her spirits than any physician's draught. Kept a still room in the east wing, full of her mixtures, though I couldn't say what's become of her recipes now. Been near 30 years since she passed." Eowyn spent the better part of that second day in the estate's dusty still room, working by lamplight to grind the cliff balm into a fine paste, testing its properties against her own knowledge of similar herbs, searching for some combination that might offer Theron more than the temporary relief of her touch alone. It was painstaking, uncertain work, and by evening she had produced only a small vial of dark, fragrant oil that might prove useful or might prove nothing at all. The storm arrived without warning shortly after supper, sweeping in off the sea with a violence that rattled every window in the old stone house. Eowyn had experienced coastal storms before, visiting relatives near the shore, but nothing had quite prepared her for the sheer force of wind and rain that seemed to shake Æthelgard's very foundations, thunder rolling overhead in long, continuous peals that left no silence between them. She found Theron in the estate's small drawing room, and one look at him told her the storm had done more than rattle windows. He sat rigid in a chair near the cold hearth, his hands gripping the armrests with white-knuckled intensity, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps entirely out of rhythm with anything the room's stillness should have provoked. His eyes, when they found hers, held none of the calm composure she had grown accustomed to over these past weeks. Only raw, unguarded fear, the kind she suspected he had spent his whole life working desperately to hide from anyone who might witness it. Theron. She crossed to him quickly, kneeling beside his chair as another peal of thunder shook the windows. "What is it? What's happening?" "The storms," he managed, his voice barely audible beneath the wind's howl. "When I was little, my father took me sailing during weather far worse than sound judgment allowed, meant to teach me courage," he said. "The boat capsized. I nearly drowned before the crew pulled me free." His hands trembled violently now, the tremor she recognized but rarely saw this pronounced. "I have not been near open water during a storm since, not truly, and Æthelgard sits close enough to the cliffs that I can hear the waves even now, even through stone walls." Elwyn understood, with sudden clarity, that this was not merely his usual affliction returning, but something deeper and more particular. An old wound the sea itself had reopened, one no amount of rest or touch alone might easily soothe. She did not hesitate. She took the chair beside his, close enough that their shoulders touched, and reached for his hand, closing her fingers firmly around his trembling grip. "You are not on that boat," she said quietly, steadily, as another crash of thunder rolled overhead. "You are in a stone house, on solid ground, and I am here beside you. The storm will pass, as storms always do, and you will still be here when it does." He did not answer at first, his breath still ragged, his hand gripping hers, with a desperation that spoke of years of unspoken terror, finally given voice. But gradually, as the minutes passed, and she continued speaking low and steady beside him, of nothing in particular, of the herbs she had gathered that day, of her mother's cottage and the sound of rain against its thatched roof, of anything that might anchor him to the present moment rather than whatever distant memory the storm had summoned, his breathing began to slow. The candles guttered low as the storm raged on outside, and still, Elwyn remained beside him, her hand never leaving his, even as the hour grew late and her own eyes grew heavy with exhaustion. She did not suggest retiring to separate rooms, and he did not ask it of her, both of them understanding without words that tonight required something neither pride nor propriety could reasonably demand they forego. Sometime past midnight, with the worst of the storm's fury finally spending itself against the cliffs, Elwyn felt the change in his hand first. The trembling stilled, the grip loosening by degrees from desperate to merely present, until at last his breathing settled into something slow and even beside her. She turned to find him asleep, truly asleep, his head tilted back against the chair, his features finally slack with a peace she had not yet seen upon his face in all the weeks she had known him. She did not move, did not dare disturb whatever fragile grace had finally found him, and remained beside him through the remaining hours of darkness, her hand still folded around his, watching the storm's last echoes fade into distant, harmless rumbling over the sea. He slept, by her careful reckoning, nearly 4 unbroken hours before the first gray light of dawn crept through the drawing-room windows. The longest natural rest he had managed, she realized with quiet wonder, since long before that terrible night in the ruined study where all of this had first begun. When he woke at last, blinking against the pale morning light, his eyes found hers with something unguarded and searching, and neither of them spoke, for a long moment, the silence between them carrying more than either had yet found words to express. The guild's delegation arrived at Aethelgard 3 days later, announced by the clatter of an unfamiliar carriage in the drive and the groundskeeper's breathless warning that Master Corvus had come with what looked like official business. Eowyn was in the still room, cataloging the small but promising results of her work with the cliff balm oil when Theron found her, his expression carrying none of the alarm she might have expected, given who waited below. "Corvus has come," he said, "with 2 men I don't recognize and a quantity of official-looking documents. I suspect he means to make some formal show of reclaiming authority over my care. Are you troubled by it?" Eowyn studied his face carefully, watching for the familiar signs, the tightness at his jaw, the faint tremor that had once accompanied even minor confrontations. There was none of it. His hands, resting easily at his sides, showed no tremor at all, and his breathing remained entirely steady, despite the news. "Strangely, no," he admitted, seeming almost as surprised by the fact as she was. "Shall we go and discover what he wants?" They found Corvus waiting in Aethelgard's modest entrance hall, flanked by 2 guild officials Eowyn recognized vaguely from her rejected application months before, their formal robes looking absurdly out of place against the weathered coastal stone. Corvus held a rolled document under one arm, his expression carrying the particular confidence of a man who believed he held every advantage. "Your Grace." He offered a bow just shallow enough to register as an insult. "The Guild has grown considerably concerned by reports reaching us of your continued care under an unlicensed practitioner, particularly given the scandal such an arrangement risks for a family of your standing. We have come to formally request your return to proper Guild oversight, effective immediately." "Formally request," Theron repeated. "Or formally demand. I confess your documents suggest the latter." Corvus's smile thinned. "The Guild holds certain authorities regarding matters of public health and safety, Your Grace, particularly where a nobleman's welfare touches upon the broader community's confidence in medical practice. We cannot in good conscience permit an unlicensed woman to continue treating a man of your position, whatever temporary comfort her methods may provide." He unrolled the document with a flourish. "This authorizes the Guild to assume immediate oversight of your care, along with confiscation of any research materials Miss Ashcombe has compiled regarding your condition, for proper scholarly review." "You mean to take her notes?" Eowyn heard the dangerous edge creeping into Theron's voice, though his composure otherwise remained entirely unshaken. "For scholarly review, as I said, it would hardly serve medicine's advancement for such observations to remain in the possession of someone without the training to properly interpret them." Eowyn felt the old, familiar flare of anger at the implication, but found herself watching Theron rather than responding immediately, curious despite the circumstances to see how he might handle this confrontation without the tremor and fury that had marked every previous encounter with the Guild's scorn. He did not raise his voice, he did not clench his fists or betray any of the physical signs she had come to associate with his affliction's approach. Instead, he regarded Corvus with the calm, unhurried authority of a man entirely secure in his own composure. "Master Corvus, I find myself curious what authority you believe permits the Guild to confiscate private property from my own estate, whatever scholarly ambitions you claim to hold. Miss Ashcombe's notes belong to her, compiled through her own observation and effort, and I have no intention of surrendering them to men who rejected her application without troubling to properly examine her knowledge in the first place." "Your Grace, I must insist." "You may insist as much as you like," Theron continued, his voice never rising, never losing its measured control. "But I would remind you that the guild's authority extends only so far as those it serves choose to recognize it, and I have already withdrawn my family's recognition entirely. You hold no more claim over my care or over Miss Ashcomb's research than any stranger off the street." Corvus's composure cracked visibly, his careful performance of authority collapsing into something closer to desperation. "Your Grace, be reasonable. This woman has no formal training, no guild sanction, nothing beyond a fortunate accident of touch that any number of village charlatans might claim to replicate. Surely you cannot mean to entrust your continued welfare and the future of your entire estate to such uncertain foundations." "I would remind you," Theron said, and now something colder entered his tone, though still without the wild edge his affliction once produced, "that I stand before you this morning entirely composed, entirely steady, despite your considerable efforts these past several minutes to provoke otherwise. 6 months ago, such a confrontation would have left me shaking, perhaps worse. Today it leaves me merely tired of your persistence." He glanced toward Elowen, something warm entering his expression despite the tension of the moment. "That improvement is Miss Ashcomb's doing, achieved through months of patient care your guild was never willing to offer. I fail to see what claim you believe that grants you over her work." The two officials flanking Corvus exchanged uncertain glances, clearly less committed to this confrontation than their leader, and Elowen sensed the moment's balance tipping decisively away from the guild's favor. "This is not finished," Corvus said finally, though the threat carried considerably less weight than his earlier confidence had promised. "The guild will not simply overlook." "The guild," Theron interrupted, "will do precisely as it pleases, as guilds generally do. But it will do so without my family's support, without access to my estate, and without the smallest claim over Miss Ashcomb's research or reputation. I believe our business here is concluded, Master Corvus. I trust you can find your own way back to the carriage." Corvus lingered a moment longer, clearly searching for some final argument that might salvage the confrontation, but finding none, he rolled his document closed with visible frustration and turned toward the door, his two companions trailing uncertainly behind him. Only when the guild's carriage had rattled fully out of sight did Elowen turn to Theron, studying his still steady hands, his calm and unhurried breathing, with something like wonder. "You did not need me," she said quietly, "not once, through all of that." "No," he agreed, and the smile that followed carried none of his old guardedness, only clear and quiet certainty. "It seems your care has given me back something I feared lost for good, though I confess, Miss Ashcombe, I find myself wanting your presence beside me, regardless of whether my affliction still requires it." Autumn had turned fully toward winter by the time they returned to Braemar Manor, the estate's grounds dusted with early frost, the great hall restored at last to its former order after the wreckage of that first terrible night. Elowen scarcely recognized the study where it had all begun, its shelves rebuilt and its chairs replaced, though she found she could not pass its door without remembering the wild-eyed man she had found there, nor without a quiet gratitude for how far he had traveled since. Theron had spent the weeks since Aethelgard in careful correspondence, closeted with his solicitor and steward for hours at a time, and though he had said little of the matter, Elowen had noticed the steady stream of letters arriving from Oakhaven, from the county council, even from certain London addresses she did not recognize. She had not pressed him for details, trusting that whatever he was building, he would share it when it was ready. He gathered her into the study on a bright, cold morning in early winter, along with the estate's steward and a solicitor she did not recognize, a stack of formal documents arranged neatly upon the desk that had once lain splintered across the floor. "I have been thinking," he began, "about what you told me the day we first struck our agreement, that you would not abandon your patients in Oakhaven, that your work belonged to the village as much as to me. I have spent these past weeks trying to find some way of honoring that promise more fully than a carriage and an open door ever could." He gestured to the documents, and the solicitor stepped forward to explain. "His Grace has established an independent foundation," the man said, "chartered to operate entirely outside the regional guild's authority. A medical academy, to be built upon Braymar's grounds, open to any practitioner of demonstrated skill, regardless of formal credential, herbalists, midwives, village healers, whose knowledge has too long gone unrecognized by institutions more concerned with pedigree than results." Elowen stared at the documents, then at Theron, uncertain for a moment that she had understood correctly. "An academy, here, with you as its founding director," Theron said quietly, "should you accept the position. I have consulted with physicians of genuine skill and open mind from as far as Edinburgh, men willing to teach formal anatomy and pharmacology alongside whatever traditional knowledge our students bring with them. In the belief that both have value, the Guild has too long refused to acknowledge. But its principles, its purpose, its very reason for existing, those I would have shaped by the woman who taught me that healing owes nothing to a diploma." For a long moment, Elowen could not find words adequate to the weight of what he offered. She thought of Corvus's dismissive sneer the day the Guild rejected her, of her mother's decades of unlicensed but faithful service to Oakhaven's poor, of every healer like them who had been turned away from institutions built to protect authority rather than advance genuine care. "The Guild will fight this," she said finally. "They will call it scandal, or worse, quackery, dressed in noble patronage." "Let them," Theron said. "I have withdrawn my family's support already, and I find I am considerably less concerned with the Guild's opinion than I once believed myself capable of being. This academy will train healers by results, not pedigree, and open its doors to any student, regardless of birth or fortune, who demonstrates genuine skill and genuine care for their patients. I can think of no fitter tribute to what you have taught me these past months." Elowen looked down at the documents once more, at her own name already inscribed in the solicitor's careful hand as founding director, and felt something settle in her chest that she had not known she was still waiting for since the Guild's rejection all those months ago. Not merely acceptance, but purpose fully realized. A door opened not only for herself, but for every healer like her who had been turned away. "I accept," she said, and watched something ease in Theron's shoulders that had nothing to do with his old affliction, and everything, she suspected, to do with simple hope finally rewarded. The academy's foundations were laid before winter's first heavy snow, and though the building itself would take the better part of a year to complete, Elowen began accepting students almost immediately. A young widow, skilled in setting bones, an elderly woman from the northern villages, whose knowledge of birthing complications exceeded anything the Guild's approved texts contained. Even, eventually, two of the Guild's own junior scholars, who had grown quietly disillusioned with Corvus's rigid authority, and sought instead an education grounded in genuine practice rather than protected privilege. Theron remained beside her through it all, not as patron alone, but as something the estate's staff had taken, without any formal announcement, to calling him plainly. Her partner in every sense the word allowed, present at her side through each new student's arrival. Each fresh challenge the Academy's founding brought. His composure now settled and steady enough that even the occasional difficult day passed without the wild fits that had once terrorized his household. On a clear evening some months later, standing together at the edge of the Academy's half-finished walls, watching lamplight flicker on in the manor windows beyond, Theron took her hand, not out of desperate need this time, but simple habit, the easy comfort of two people who had long since stopped needing extraordinary reason to reach for one another. "I used to think," he said quietly, "that my worth lay entirely in what I could withstand without breaking. My father taught me that, and I spent half my life proving it to my own considerable cost." He glanced at her, something soft and certain in his expression. "You taught me instead that strength might mean simply allowing myself to be helped, without shame, by someone willing to offer it freely." Elowen said nothing, only tightened her hand around his, watching the last light fade over the grounds where a guild rejection and a duke's desperate fury had, against every reasonable expectation, built something neither of them could have imagined that first terrible night. A foundation, in every sense the word allowed, for whatever came next.